Thank you for the introduction, Anna. So I'm Amy Pianta. I am Director of Business and Collection Development and a Research Scientist at ICPSR. I chair the Professional Development Committee for the IASSIST Professional Association that puts on this webinar series, and we are really excited to have our next installment of our webinar series today. So if you are new to the IASSIST community, I encourage you to visit our website and take a look at what we have to offer. And I think also you are provided with links to the Data Curation Network, who's presenting today. So also please take a look at that and visit their information on their website. So with that, I will turn over the presentation to our first presenter, who will present the rest of the team that are talking today, Hannah Hadley, who's the project manager for the IMLS training grant for the Data Curation Network. Hannah, go ahead and take it away. Thank you for coming to talk with all of us today.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you, Annalie. Thank you both for setting this up for us. Today we're going to have a Primerpalooza, which is going to show our new primers that were created from the second Specialized Data Curation Workshop. If you want to go to the next slide, please. And I'm just going to go through our presenters for each primer group today real quick. Elizabeth Blackwood, who's a digital archivist at California State University, Channel Islands. Amy Koshoffer, who's the Assistant Director of Research and Data Services for University of Cincinnati. Margarita Corral, who is a data analysis specialist at Brandeis University. Ossom-Williamson, who is the Director of Research Data Services for the University of Texas at Arlington. Adam Kriesburg, who is an Assistant Professor at Simmons University School of Library and Information Science. Standa Pesha, who is a data curator at Purdue University. Mara Blake, who is one of our DCN education instructor mentors, and she's going to speak for a group that she had mentored. She's a data services manager at Johns Hopkins University. And Wendy Kozlowski, who is also a primer mentor and DCN educator and a data curation specialist at Cornell University. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I just want to give kind of a quick overview of our project and its background. We are a subgroup of the Data Curation Network. The network is a community of data curators that work with researchers to share their data in trusted repositories. And it uses a model of shared curatorial staff to leverage expertise across the network. There are currently 10 partner institutions in the DCN, and they are looking to add 2 new partners during this period. And I did put a link on there if you were interested in seeing if you would like to become a partner. So our subgroup, which involves education, has provided 3 free specialized data curation workshops, thanks to generous funding by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. We also provide other workshops and instruction. We supervise the creation and maintenance of the data curation primers, which are resources for the data curator. And we work on developing other resources for education. Next slide, please. So we're going to focus on the IMLS funded workshops where these primers began. So the primers today are from our second workshop, which happened about a year ago at Johns Hopkins University. And we also had 2 other free specialized data curation workshops. The first was co-located at the DLF Forum in October of 2018, and the third was at Washington University in St. Louis in November of 2019. If you want to go to the next slide, please. And these are subgroup members. I just wanted to acknowledge their work on developing our curriculum, helping with workshop logistics, being instructors at our workshops, and mentoring the primer creation groups. Next slide, please. And this is just kind of a glimpse of our workshop experience. The two photos on the left are from the workshop at Johns Hopkins, where these primers that we're going to hear about today were created. You can see the workshops are interactive, they are collaborative, they're heavily hands-on. Next slide, please. Now, our curriculum is based around the DCN's model for curation. I think people have seen before the curated model. It's very cute. It is similar to the training that all the DCN curators received. The curated model, we use that because it provides a framework to approach curation that can be commonly understood for the purpose of data curation education. And next slide, please. Now, primer creation is an approximately 6-month process that begins at our workshops. So attendees select a topic on the second day of the workshop. On the first day, they have an opportunity to brainstorm ideas that they might want to work on. And then on that second day of the workshop, they sign up for the working groups. We have a working session where we give them a roadmap and a primer template, and a DCN mentor is assigned to them. They will meet monthly with their DCN mentor for that approximate 6-month time period. We have a peer review in month 3. Peer review participants include members of the DCN education subgroup, and anyone who has attended our workshops. The revisions are then created after that peer review, and at the end they are published to GitHub, and they're also published as an archival copy to University of Minnesota's institutional repository, which is DRUM. Now, the actual primers, though, are on GitHub, and those are living primers that anyone who's here today is welcome to come and interact with. If you have information that you think should be added to a primer, you can always create a pull request, or you can contact an author. If you want to go to the next slide, please. And this just kind of gives you a primer example here. And what we have shown here in the GIF is the Confocal microscopy primer. So that is one of the primers that you'll hear about today. And you can see some of the components that a primer will have, such as the overview table at the beginning that will help you to know if this is the primer that you want to use. They also have things like key questions for the curator, or key clarifications you might want to get from the researcher. They may talk about metadata standards, tools that you might want to use with the format or within the topic. And there's, other things that they might include in there as well. We've had some surveys and interviews that were conducted in those. And if you go to the next slide, then I will get right to the primers that will be presented today. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Blackwood on behalf of the STL Data Curation Primer.
Awesome. Hopefully everybody can hear me. We can go on to the next slide if that is possible. Awesome. So again, thanks for joining us today, and also a big shout out and thank you to Hannah, who has walked us through this whole process. And I know both me and for my group, we've had a really great experience with this whole process, and it's been a great learning experience. But back to the STL file and our deep exploration of this file. We wanted to give you a brief introduction to the file and introduce you to the example that we used throughout our primer, which is this IBIS. A member of our group is actually at UMiami, and IBIS is their mascot, so we were lucky to find this very on-brand example. The expansion of STL is stereolithography file, but in our primer, we also covered a few common misattributions that we found while performing our research. The one that I ran into most often for STL was standard template library for the C++ language. So those are a couple things to keep in mind when you first start working with one of these files, or the types of misattributions that you might get. It was originally patented by 3D Systems Inc. in 1985 and is currently the de facto industry standard for 3D printing. The format approximates 3D surfaces of a model with triangles or facets, all of different sizes and shapes in order to achieve a representation suitable for viewing or reproducing using digital fabrication or some type of 3D printing software. Though it is really important to note that this format describes only the surface geometry of a three-dimensional object. It does not contain any data representing color, texture, or other common model attributes, so only the surface geometry. And these files are usually generated as an end product of a 3D modeling or spatial capture process. And that is a brief introduction to the file, so if we could go on to slide 2. All right, so the next thing we wanted to highlight was the major key curatorial consideration that surrounds this file. We want specifically to highlight that STL files can be saved in either binary on the left or ASCII format. While the binary format is smaller, we recommend saving or transforming the file into ASCII because it makes the file much more readable. And while it's saved in ASCII, it's easily opened, it's easily understood using a text editor, much more human readable. And we think the ability to read the file outweighed the benefit of the file being a tiny bit smaller when it's saved in binary. Moving on to how we would actually view or transform that file, we can go on to slide 3. So our recommendations for viewers and editors, we tested a ton of these. For a tool that will allow you to simply view the file, maybe you're not going to be editing it and you need something very lightweight, I would check if you wanted to use the tool on the left, GLC Player. This is what you can use to make sure all of the surfaces are connected in your STL file. Check for any extraneous pieces. A lot of the examples that we used actually did have extraneous pieces that were floating off to the side. Basically, it's a viewer that'll let you rotate and check on all of the various sides of an STL file. That would be GLC Player. It's a free open source tool that is very simple to operate. But to remember that it's strictly for viewing and navigating the model. You can't actually do any changes to it. Our second option here would be MeshLab. This is what you would want to use if the STL that you're working on might need some edits. So if it needs to be transformed from binary to ASCII, or it needs a surface repair, maybe it has an open hole or an open side, we'd recommend MeshLab. It's both a viewer and an editor. It's free, it's open source, and it's great for viewing, transforming, and repairing, but it does lack the functionality to create files. So you couldn't make your own model using MeshLab. But it is very user-friendly and it has a very simple interface. And we really liked it because it had great documentation for performing a lot of these simple tasks. So, and in our primer, we also include some basic documentation about how to perform that transformation from binary to ASCII. So that's included in the primer. And both of these tools work on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So now let's go on to slide 4. All right, so basic deposit recommendations that we wanted to start out with. At the bare minimum for you to deposit an STL, we really recommend of course, the original file prior to any transformations, the transformed file from either binary to ASCII if that was necessary, and also a README file that describes the subject matter of the STL, how the file was captured or designed. Specifically, we want to know what software, just because it's very difficult to actually replicate something using different software, especially when you're 3D printing. So it would be really helpful to know what software, the scale of the subject matter, so whether the unit of the model is inches or millimeters, those types of things. A list of any transformations or edits that have occurred by the depositor on behalf of the original author or creator. And then lastly, a license file or some type of license that describes the limitations placed on the STL file in terms of reproduction, reuse, and remixing, which we all know can be very complicated. Additional files that we think could also be really useful to include would be screenshots of the digital model, how it was represented or rendered in a viewer. we think that's really useful because a lot of repository systems don't offer a way to render 3D models. So it's something that could be used as the thumbnail or attached so folks at least have an idea of what they're looking at. Additionally, images of any physical models that were printed or fabrication generated by the file. Additional documentation related to the SDL files, either prior generations, design or capture process, and then a list of other publications where the STL file was used. And those would be our primary recommendations for deposit. And if we can move on to our last slide. The last area that we wanted to highlight is a place that if anyone has suggestions or would like to offer some advice, this was where we ran into some questions, and that would be specifically about what metadata standards we should include with these files. Our issue is that we ran into is that STLs are generated from so many different disciplines, from architecture to biomedical engineering to art history, you name it. We felt there was really no way that we could generate an exhaustive list of standards. So we gave a few examples of the ones that we found were most common, but feel that there are probably loads more that could be useful to this file. So our recommendation was kind of to go with whatever the subject matter of the publication it was used in or something along those lines. But if anyone has recommendations, we would be more than happy to hear from you. So that is an STL file. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is going to be Amy Koshoffer for the Confocal microscopy primer.
So thank you very much. This is Amy Koshoffer, and I'm speaking on behalf of my group, Susan Ivey from NC State, Gretchen Sneff, who's at Temple, and Hyojin Wang, who's at Carnegie Mellon, and our mentor, Lisa Johnston, who's at the University of Minnesota. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so we chose to focus on confocal microscopy data. Two of the members of our team in our previous lives did research and generated this kind of data, so we were interested to work on the primer. And confocal microscopy is a type of microscopy that's using a laser light going through a very small pinhole so that you get a very narrow band of focus for the image. So it allows you to capture a very thin slice of whatever material you're looking at. So in the image that you're looking at there, this is tissue, and you're looking at cell parts. And so the content of the image is actually very important. And so this is where we're going to be focusing our curatorial energies on for the data. So if I could have the next slide, please. I did want to say that our confocal microscopy primer could actually be applied to other types of microscopy, but we did specify confocal here, so that could be a future step for our primer. But the data that you'll be collecting is in the format of an image. And a lot of microscopes generate an image that can be proprietary. And you also, when you're collecting data, it may be one image or multiple images. So a data set could be a set of images. So this is a consideration. What is the actual raw data that you're trying to capture in an experiment? And so when you're thinking about curating, you should also be thinking about the processing of the sample. So this would be pre-image capture processing, and then also post-image capture processing. And when you receive the file, is it something that could be opened up in the software ImageJ? And if it can be opened up, then you are at that's a good open source format. And this software also, ImageJ, is an open source. So it also is, they are making modifications to it so that it is beginning to be able to open these other proprietary formats. But we suggest that you would follow open standards and try to get to a open format for the image, which would be a TIFF file. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we modeled our primer on the Jupyter Notebook primer. A shout out to them because we really liked the decision tree that they created, and so we also created a decision tree for people thinking about going through the curation process. Again, the content of the image is very important. So what is being captured? What are the colors representing? So this is all the pre-image processing, and that is either biologically significant or significant to the material. So we would suggest that you capture that kind of information in the README file. So hopefully you're getting a README file from the submitter, and then you're getting a set of images. So what documentation do you need? If it's a proprietary format, you would be suggesting that you would be moving to an open source like a TIFF. And also from the microscope and the image, there could be metadata that needs to be captured that's specific to this kind of data. So an example would be, what is the magnification of the image? What is the pinhole size? This is microscopy, microscope specific metadata that could be coming out, and then other information about the image itself. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So as I mentioned, there could be some future directions for our primer. We struggled a lot as we created it about what is the minimum you need to be describing, and you may get from a researcher that they're giving you just a portion of the slide. They're telling you only a certain amount of the processing, and that would be something that we would need to come to as best practices for this type of metadata, or sorry, data. But it is very important to have information about what are the colors that you're capturing, what does that represent for the biological sample, and has there been any processing? Are you looking at a small area, or is there other raw data that is actually the whole image, like a whole area that has been captured? So that kind of information, we would be looking for direction for that. But at this point, we are suggesting to capture as much of that as possible. We really relied very heavily on the cell image library, and I provided the link there to kind of give us what would be the standard, but there's not been a standard for metadata set in this area. So there could be a lot more work done to determine what is the best metadata and requirements for these kinds of experiments. And I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy. If we can go to the next slide, please. And next we have Peace Ossom-Williamson for the PDF Data Curation Primer.
Hello, I'm here representing the PDF Primer group, which consists of me. I'm from the University of Texas at Arlington, Nicole Contaxis, who's at NYU, Margaret Lamb, who's at George Mason University, and Adam Kriesburg, who's at Simmons University, and our mentor was Jake Carlson. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the PDF format. It's very well known, so we really wanted to go into detail of quick things that people can forget or otherwise overlook, and some areas, some gray areas around PDF documents. Just to start off with, some areas that we would love feedback around are listed here on the screen, which are unresolved issues and further questions. Since PDF is such a well-used format, a lot of the kind of issues that might potentially be unresolved have been worked out, or at least there are some standards around those. And so if there are ones that we did not touch on, I think that would be a great area for growth for this primer, as well as the curated checklist. There are PDF specific items within the checklist, but I believe that as these primers grow, there's more area for growth in that checklist. Okay, so the PDF document is primarily used for fixed format electronic documents. The great thing is that since version 1.7, it is published as an open format by the International Organization for Standardization. So it is open and it is available to be read, edited, and utilized by a large number of software, which makes it a preferred format for curation of document types of files. It's also the de facto standard, so many documents are either going to be provided to you as a PDF or provided to you in a format that is easily converted into a PDF, and that also makes easy for curation. It's also preferred due to its preservation of document fidelity on any machine, regardless of what fonts, software, and other items or capabilities are on that machine. PDF documents preserve the formatting of the original document. Some of the software that can be used to create, read, edit, and convert PDF files include Adobe Acrobat products, which are the most commonly used for PDF files, but there's also Nitro PDF Reader and PDF TK, which is a command line tool. There are a number of other tools that we list within the primer as well, and that primer is linked, of course, from Hannah's original link to all of the primers. All right, so the three most common uses that we noticed from PDF documents were data description, reporting related methods and results, and data storage and sharing. So when we refer to data description, we're talking about anything like code books and data dictionaries, README files, exported survey instruments, and so on. It's kind of describing the data, basically how it was collected or information about how it's measured and so on. Reporting related methods and results are things like research protocols, related figures that go along with the data, and the manuscript itself. And data storage and sharing is probably the most obvious, where it's reporting out the data in a PDF format. So regarding curation of PDF documents, we kind of broke it up into the various ways that you would utilize a PDF, since they are used for such a variety of uses. For the first use, which is data description, we believe it's most important to kind of repeat information as often as necessary. So for example, information that may be available in the repository should be repeated, like that metadata should be repeated in the README file as well, so that when there is a download of all of the files within a data set, that metadata information comes along with it for that researcher who may not ever revisit the repository website again. These are things like the creator's information and project information, description of the data files, licenses and permissions, abbreviations, measurements, and so on. This also includes variable names, data types, acceptable values, and null values and their interpretations within the data. Also within data description, we have it broken out even further within our primer with associated recommendations for each type of data description. For example, like a README, we have an additional guidelines for elements that should be present within a README file and other types of data description files, as well as examples. Now for reporting related methods and results, this is for the kind of informing the use of the data. One thing that's important about open data is the idea of having enough information to be able to replicate what someone did, or to be able to utilize the data that they've provided without having to reach out to the original creator or the owner of that data. And so that second level of PDF document would be things that will allow for that use. So items that describe the research methods and or the findings, so write-ups, protocols, and so on. Items like visualizations, which may summarize the data, summary tables, visualizations of findings and other charts. Informed consent forms that show that, like say it was a human study and they were consenting to the data being made available. And anything else that would help with data interpretation are a great thing to make available along with the data itself. Now, in regards to sharing the data itself, we do not recommend sharing it in a PDF format. Data are best shared in an actionable format, so that's something like a spreadsheet or a database or in other formats other than PDF. This is not where a PDF shines. However, even though data may be, we recommend data are shared in a reuse ready sharing format, also called a source file sharing format. It can be helpful, as I mentioned before, to have those data summaries where you have means, distributions, and so on, or having something kind of summarizing the data in a PDF format for that human readable element. Okay, and so our major question when people are curating a PDF is, what is the purpose of the file? We want to make sure that kind of aligning with what I said before, the PDF format is the recommended format for the type of content that is being shared and being curated, and determining if it would be more useful either in a machine readable format or along with the same file in a machine readable format. Oftentimes having it available in both is helpful for, once again, that human readable element where the PDF can be scanned very quickly and something like a TXT or other type of file can be utilized for other purposes, easier editing, and so on. One major thing to do, as I mentioned, we have the full curated checklist within the primer itself, which can be read later. But one major change that we recommend, if it's not already present for PDF files that you receive, is the PDF A3. So the preservation format, PDF A, is designed for long-term preservation and archiving and does not include features that would make the format unsuitable for preservation, like encryption. And so we recommend converting PDF files to PDF A3 and anything that may be embedded within the PDF file. And as I mentioned before, retaining the PDF along with the original or source file of where that data may have originally come from and can be utilized very easily in a new software. So that is a really quick summary of the PDF primer.
Thanks so much, Peace. If we can go to the next slide, please. And I also want to mention, it sounded like there was some trouble trying to use our link to the GitHub primers. I did put that in the chat. And also our next speaker will be Adam Kriesburg for the Google Docs Data Curation Primer.
Great. Okay, thank you, Hannah. And so, yeah, I'm going to just jump into it here. I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Nadia Dixon, who is the city archivist for the city of Somerville, Massachusetts. And we tackled, it's always nice to see the groupings of these. Similar to the PDF primer, our primer on Google Docs kind of tackles a ubiquitous format, and yet one that reveals a series of potentially complicating questions when we consider how to manage Google Docs files in a data curation context. So we can jump to the next slide. So, you know, I don't think Google Docs need an introduction to people attending this webinar. But I think the most important thing to kind of note about Google Docs and Google Drive in general, we initially started this work thinking about primarily Word doc style Google Docs files, and then quickly realized as we were writing the primer that many of the same issues applied to the other kinds of productivity Office Suite files that Google Drive allows. So Google Drive is, used as kind of a catch-all for so much work that people are doing today, collaborative research and other kinds of writing, other kinds of outputs that are associated with data creation, management, analysis, and reporting. So we felt as though this was an important primer to create because while Google Docs mimic the features and functionality of Microsoft Office products, Google Drive files don't live locally on your machine, and if you want to download them, export them, and include them with sort of a larger data package that you'd like to upload or submit to an institutional repository, there are just some interesting questions, mostly related to features, functionality, and knowledge of the format that are changing over time. So the most important thing, and this is going to be the subject of 2 of the 4 slides of this presentation, is that Google Docs changes regularly over time. So it's important to remember when you're managing files that were exported from Google Docs to consider whether or not the behavior of the system of the Google Drive Docs environment has changed from now to the last time that you worked with these files. So as a quick example, if folks remember, initially one of the challenges of working with Google Docs in this kind of way collaboratively is that it didn't have track changes and it didn't have comments, which are 2 features of collaborative writing that are really fundamental to how a lot of work happens these days. So if you've got Google Docs files that are old, they might not have those elements in them, and if you do use them now, or if you download them now, those features are retained when you download them into Word document format. So all right, let's jump to the next slide. So essentially, the bulk of the primer are a series of questions because, again, the files themselves are not don't exist in kind of complex formats. All the export functionalities allow you to export Google Docs files to a variety of standard and open to varying degrees formats. So the important thing to understand for these kinds of files and working with them is to consider the context in which they were created and the types of sort of additional metadata and documentation that you might need in order to make sure you kind of have the right file. So things like drafts, how you understand what a final draft is, and sort of asking users to be clear about what kinds of uses they're employing with Google Docs, thinking about who had access to edit and who made changes to documents. That's also important for export because depending on the permissions, sometimes only the owner of the document may have permission to download and export documents. And you can imagine that playing out interestingly in perhaps a research lab environment where the PI either owns some of the more important documents for uploading into the institutional repository, or the grad students have control over those documents. And so those kinds of permission questions can be important because they may limit the ability for you as the curator to access the files that you'd like to include with a larger data set. Getting back to comments, sometimes comments are important, other times comments are not important. So understanding that and understanding exactly what this kind of file is being used for in relation to other data files, analysis files, readmes, etc. And then a few more kind of technical questions. How does exporting the document affect the context, and are there features that may affect display when exported to a different file type? So if we jump to the next slide, we'll see a little bit about that. So as I was mentioning earlier, Google Docs allows you to export to Microsoft Office formats, open document formats, RTF, PDF, plain text, HTML, and EPUB. So that's kind of a wide range. But again, thinking about that question, how different export file types affect the display. If you export a document that has images, charts, etc., maybe a report or even a README file that might have charts, or rather, charts. In plain text, it will be small and human readable and durable format, but it will strip out, obviously, all those kind of rich media features, such as images and charts. Additionally, there's the ubiquitous question of special characters, and we say may not be supported in exported documents because, again, it's very hard to get clear documentation from Google about what happens to files between the time that they are living in Google Docs and when they're exported out of Google Docs into Microsoft Word or PDF or plain text formats. So we've got some links in the primer to the Google Docs documentation that we were using in writing this, but one area that we would invite additional feedback and pull requests on are more sorts of documentation that we may have missed, because Google's online documentation is quite dense, and it's very possible that we missed something. Another couple of things to consider here, exporting. So I've been talking mostly about exporting individual files, but if you've used Google Docs, you also are familiar with the idea that you can organize files into folders. And just know that if you export an entire folder from Google Drive, that will download as a zipped file that you may or may not be happy with, may or may not want ultimately for use in other curation contexts. And again, getting back to ownership, you can't export a folder that is shared with you. You can only export a folder that's owned by you. Now, keep in mind, finally, that these are features that, as they exist right now, this might change in the future as Google sort of develops and continues to roll out new features for these tools, because they are always working on them. Finally, regarding comments, when we wrote the majority of this primer in 2019, comments were preserved in docx format, but not the names of the authors. Similarly, in open document format, you could see the usernames, but not the timestamps of the comments, which might be useful depending on the context in which you're using these files. If you export to PDF, there are no comments, and the API sentence there at the end mostly relates to the idea that you can, depending on your familiarity and ability to use APIs, you can use the larger Google account exporting features to get at different metadata and extract files in different ways using the API. Okay, next slide, please. So just kind of wrapping up, as I've already mentioned a couple times, the sort of most important thing for Google Docs in the future is really just keeping track of the changes to the platform and documentation of those changes, which can be quite hard because Google rolls them out, and they also roll them out to different users at different times. So what you might be seeing in your Google Docs environment or Google Drive environment may not be what a researcher you might be working with is seeing. So that is something to always kind of keep top of mind when you're working with researchers on exporting and getting Google Drive files out into PDF or Word document formats. And obviously, if you're using PDF formats, well, we've got another primer that helps provide some insight into how to manage those files. So, all right, with that, I'll leave it to the primer itself and look forward to seeing anyone kind of engaging with us on there and providing additional pull requests and contributing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, lost my voice. Thank you so much, Adam, for that. And also you bring up a very good point about the Google Drive products changing. We expect this to happen with the formats, and even the topics can change. And that's the reason why we have these as living documents that will evolve over time with those changes. So please do feel welcome to continue suggesting changes on GitHub, and also for the primer authors to be involved in keeping up with that information. And if we want to go to the next slide, please. And our next speaker is going to be Margarita Corral for the Atlas TI Data Curation Primer.
Hi everyone, I'm Margarita Corral from Brandeis University. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together this event. And also I'd like to thank Hannah and Dave. I've learned a lot from them during all this process. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so I chose to focus on Atlas TI. Atlas TI is a program for qualitative analysis. One of the advantages of this software is that it handles different types of data that are all kept in a project. This project can handle different types of data, such as text documents, images, audio recording, videos, PDF files, and so on. So the curator will receive a project bundle with all or most of these components that we have listed here. So this project will have documents. So that's the data that we are analyzing. They can be interviews, data from focus groups, and so on. And as I said before, these documents can come in many different formats. Then one of the main components of any qualitative project are quotations. So quotations are whatever we select from the document that we think is interesting to our research. And basically what the researcher is going to be doing is assigning codes to these quotations. So the code is going to be a short phrase that captures the essence of that quotation. Yeah, so the end goal is to find patterns in the data, come up with themes and relationships between all these elements. Sometimes we see that projects have memos. So those are notebooks where the researcher is going to write down their thoughts or ideas that come to mind as they go. Atlas PI has a way to represent in a visual way relationships between all the components in the project, like between codes, quotations, documents, and so on. So it's another useful way to come up with relationships and patterns in your data. And finally, we can cluster documents, codes, memos, and networks to use them as filters, as a way to analyze your data. So as we see, Atlas PI has many different components that we have the curator should keep in mind when curating this type of file. So can we move to the next slide? Yeah. So the curator will have to keep in mind that we may have other associated data to these projects. So a researcher can export all the different components as reports that can be saved as Word documents and Excel files. So this is like an additional thing to keep in mind and to see how these associated data are curated. Like we'll have to keep in mind that we can have images for the networks, Excel files for the code book or for the memo report, and so on. So these projects can get some complicated. They can add some complication to the process of curating, as we have very different type of files formats. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, so basically the primer has a series of questions for the curator, and sometimes as is one of the proprietary software, sometimes we may not have the project itself. One of the advantages of Atlas PI is that the project can be exported as a QDPX file so that it can be opened in other software, like open source software or other proprietary software for qualitative analysis. And so the first question obviously is like, can I open the project? Do I have to worry about the Atlas PI version used by the author or not? This is not a problem anymore with the newer versions, but previous versions of the software were very problematic in the sense that they had to be open with the exact same version of the software. So then the curator should check if there is a code book, if there is any metadata, if they follow a protocol to protect human subjects. Most of the times these projects deal with human subjects. Yeah, so basically follow all these guidelines about if we have all the elements to understand what the project is about and what it's doing, so that we can reproduce this later. And yeah, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, and this slide is basically just a reminder for human subject concerns for all these type of programs that deal with qualitative analysis. We have to keep in mind that we have to follow the IRB guidelines and check that we cannot identify any of the subjects. Yeah, so there is a great research guide on human subjects protection guidelines that you can all check out. And just for the future of this primer, I'd like to see what happens when we open a project in a different software, like does this other software keep all the elements of the Atlas TI project or not? Like, it's something that we don't have time to check, and that's something that future versions of this primer could check. Yes, so that's all I have for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margarita. And if we can go to the next slide. Our next presenter is Standa Pesha for the R primer.
Oh,
okay, Standa.
So can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, so I'm representing the R primer group. So besides me, there was a Kat Koziar from University of California, Riverside, Linda Kellem from Cornell, and our mentor was Joel Herden. So we were looking at R. Next slide, please. Which is, and one more, which is basically a script of instructions for data processing, analyzing, and visualization. In recent years, we've seen an increasing number of files with the extension R coming into our repositories. So in our group, we decided this might be a good candidate for a primer. This is not particularly new format, but is becoming increasingly popular across disciplines. And as we were looking into this R landscape, we also realized that we are not going to spend our time or energy on all possible formats which are related to R, but we will focus strictly on the script, the file format for the R. Next slide, please. Yes. So the script file for R is relatively simple. It's a plain text, but why we think that the primer is important or useful is because R is becoming used in across many disciplines, and because it's such a simple type from the preservation point of view, because it's plain text, there are some consideration curators should keep in mind when they are curating data that include the R files. Where we do see R particularly strongly represented is when it comes to the data visualization, data analysis, but it's increasingly, and this is pertinent since today is the DH day, in digital humanities, where R is also fairly well represented. We were looking both at, so when curators are looking at the R files, they can explore those files using any text editor, but it might be useful to use also more specialized platforms like is the R Studio, which is IDE for R. But as I said, text editor can work as well. So please, next slide. So what are the curation questions or key curation concerns? So the curator should ask what's the purpose and what's the objective of the script, and that will drive further questions. Because it's the processing or instruction script, there are typically no data included in the file. So the curator needs to ask if the data are available. Are they provided with the R file, or are they available somewhere on a publicly accessible URL? What's also important for R is that often R depends, in order to work properly, it depends on what's called packages, which do make working with R much more straightforward, more easy, and that's also why the format is becoming more popular recently. So the packages need to be documented as well. In our primer, we spent relatively long time discussing how to document R and the data practices around it. So there can be a README file which will in fairly extensive manner explain the purpose and the use of the R so that it works properly, and possible reusers of the script will get the results they expect. The more minimal approach to documenting the R is to have comments within the script itself. What we also often see is that the provenance in the R scripts are not documented that well. So it's also important to document the provenance of the script, who created it and when. Sometimes even the version of R is important. What's also important is whether the packages that are used are openly available. Typically, they would be stored in the CRAN R packages repository. They might be also included in GitHub, where they are publicly available. But some packages are sort of custom made, available only to the research team. And when that happens, the curator need to be aware to ask for those packages to be part of the data set. Otherwise, the script may not work properly. And so those are the key curation questions. So if you can proceed to the next slide. So our future work, or where the tutorial or the primer may take us, is to explore the other files of that R data science landscape. And this might be either the slightly older file formats like RDA and RData, which actually do contain the data and some of the environmental variables, or other possibility would to look into the files which are probably more recent, like are the R&D files or R project files, which basically still are text files, but they do have some functionalities that allow to run a variety of scripts within those files. The other possible avenue to explore are the new practices in the data science, how researchers do share and publish the data, because they are not relying only on R. Often Python is being used in the research workflow of people who are using R. And also the delivery of the files is often much more dynamic, where the use of HTML and the locally installed browser is being utilized. So these are maybe some of the future steps either our team or any other team may explore. So this would be all from our team about R, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Standa. If you'll go to the next slide, please. And our next speaker is going to be the DCN mentor, Mara Blake, for the GeoJSON Data Curation Primer.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much to Hannah and IASSIST and ICPSR and all the panelists for putting this on. As Hannah mentioned, I'm the mentor for this primer on GeoJSON, but the real credit goes to the authors, Nadia, Genevieve, Kesha, Raina, and Rachel, who did a great job. And I'm just going to give a very brief introduction because I certainly can't do justice to it the way they would, but let me give you an intro and maybe encourage you to look at it more. If we could go on to the next slide. So GeoJSON is a geospatial data interchange format, as you can see here, and it's used for vector data, which we often consider points, lines, and polygons and their attributes. And you know, in the interest of time, because we're a little over, I'll just give you a high-level overview of what you might look for in this primer. So some of the primer has sections on an overview of the format, recommended software for opening, metadata standards and readmes, and preservation considerations. I think a real strength of this primer are the many step-by-step instructions with screenshot tutorials, so that if you're new to this format, this primer would really help you work with different software. It recommends working with QGIS, which is an open source software for working with geospatial data, and open source GIS software that works on both Macs and PCs, which is often a problem for proprietary GIS software using it on a Mac. And the other thing I'd encourage everybody to look at are the results of an online survey, an online questionnaire that the authors of this primer developed. And the results are included in an appendix of this primer and are really interesting to see what actual users of data are doing with GeoJSON. So that's kind of the overview, and I'm sure that I speak on behalf of all the authors of the primer that would welcome questions or comments in the GitHub. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mara. Can we go to the next slide, please? And also a DCN mentor, Wendy Kozlowski, will speak for the Tableau Data Curation Primer group.
Hi, thank you all for sticking around. I will be brief. I cannot take credit for writing this. I just mentored the two fabulous authors, Tricia Adamus, who's from the University of Wisconsin and Madison, and Christine Malinowski, who is at MIT. And they couldn't be here today. So next slide. I also am going to just give a super high level overview. I cannot do justice to this data format. I'm not particularly familiar with it, but Tableau is a software that's specific for data exploration, analysis, and visualization. And this particular primer, I feel, did a really good job, especially for someone who may not be as familiar with it, not works with it intimately, but gets a data set that needs to be curated with it. They go through and do a great job describing the format, so file types and structures, and key and different activities that would need to be done for the actual Tableau workbook versus the underlying data. So the workbooks can contain things like worksheets and dashboards and stories, but the data is separate from that, and how a curator needs to address those things. They also did a really great job, obviously you can see in this slide, giving some key ideas for curators to address when working with researchers who give this kind of data set. They also go through and outline content that should be laid out, or recommended content to be laid out in the metadata, in particular in a README format. And they address issues around preservation. This is, as you can see, a proprietary format, so it has some interesting issues around preservation and how that can be addressed. And they walk through the FAIR principles and issues that curators can look at for each of those basic FAIR principles. So please do explore and give feedback. And like all the other primers you've heard about today, this is meant to be a live document and can be built on and improved as people work more extensively with these formats. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to be very brief because I apologize that we've gone over time, but I just wanted to give you a quick update on the primers that are also in progress being written right now from the third workshop that happened at Washington University in St. Louis last November. We have, you can see in the orange on this, SAS, ISO images, GeoTIFF, Darwin Core, neuroimaging, qualitative data, oral histories, databases and Twitter data that are being worked on. Also, we have some internal groups from the Data Curation Network that are working on human subjects, consent forms, and genomics data. And we also have some beta groups. Now that's something that we're looking at how we can do. These are groups that were not affiliated with the workshops, but that have approached us and are independently doing a primer. They do have a DC and mentor that is assigned to them, and they are also going to go through the peer review process. And right now we have one for chemistry data primers, and we have one that is probably going to happen for a qualitative topic. And if you want to go to the next slide, please. And since we aren't having the questions, you can certainly leave a message for us at datacurationnetwork.org. We also encourage you to go to our data repository at GitHub and to please interact with the primers. You can contact the authors of the primers if you had ideas to add on there. But we really would love to hear from you. If you go to the next slide, please. And I want to thank everyone. This is everyone that was involved in the second workshop, all of our attendees, all of our primer authors. They did such an amazing job, and we so appreciate them staying with us for this project. And if you go to the next slide, please. And thanks again to our IMLS workshop subgroup, and also to our webinar host, and especially Amy Payanta and Annalise Shelton. Thank you both so much for setting all of this up for us. And just to wrap up, again, if anyone wants to contact us, they can go through datacurationnetwork.org, or they can go through the GitHub repository with the primers. And we also, again, thank IASSIST so much for all of this and for this opportunity.
Thank you for letting us participate. Have a great afternoon.